Good morning, everybody. Welcome. We are so glad to have such a large audience today for today's chat. I know this is a very popular topic. We're going to be hearing about Tier 2 and Tier 3 implementation today. Our presenters will be Kat Rollerson and Dama Absher from our project. And we also have a special guest joining us today from Duval County. Trying to find her information.
Michelle Johnson. Yes, and I will give her a special introduction in just a moment.
That's great. Okay, well, I'm going to hand it over to Kat to get us started. And putting the links to the handouts in the chat right now so you can follow along if you'd like.
Thanks, Betsy. I appreciate you. So good morning, everybody. We are so glad to see so many registered and coming to join us this morning, this very chilly morning where we are up by Jacksonville. I'm going to do some quick intro, and it's just with the broad audience we have with us today, give some reminders about what we mean by Tier 2 and 3 system implementation. And then the more exciting part will be highlighting some implementer examples. And we will kind of do those interchangeably between district support case examples and then school level support. And our special guest from Duval has a vast experience with school coaching and supporting teams to implement this. So she will be highlighting a couple from Duval for us across her experience on 3 different projects. And then as always, we never can leave you without resources, especially when we see you for such a short amount of time today on such a big topic. So we will be very good, including myself, about when we hyperlinked a resource for you so you can find it quickly. And then you'll see a couple throughout the presentation from Marion County and from Duval and Michelle's work. So we can always share things after if we didn't already hyperlink it for you. So intro stuff, when we say Tier 2 and 3 systems implementation, a lot of people start to just think of only the interventions themselves. So we get really excited about that magical intervention that's going to come in and it's going to improve behaviors across a school building. What we want you to think about as we go through the presentation today is more of those foundational things that we know teams need to implement those interventions and use data to make it be magical for them across Tier 2 and Tier 3. So we use this slide a lot, but we talk about those foundations of a team. You see when we go across Tier 1 to Tier 3, a team is a foundational structure that we have to have. Things increase across the 3 tiers as they stack on top of each other and work together. So our behavioral expertise increases as one factor that we see. Using data, we use data for decision-making across all 3 tiers, but we definitely intensify that practice and get more intense and individualized data as we move across to Tier 3. So we'll talk through some of those examples. The last one I would highlight on here is that team capacity across all 3 tiers. And Michelle always does a great job talking this out when she works with teams, that it really does take some planning with teams to get some things in place first before we can just start off implementing interventions and monitor how they're going for us. So we're going to focus on those features that set us up for success across tiers today. And if you are, these are probably the most unexciting slides, but good reminders for the team. If the other way we define systems fidelity is our system fidelity measures. So if you are, and I know we have a very nice mixed audience from district and school level today. If you are at the district level, my DCs that I love out there, or district team members, you support schools in completing regular systems fidelity measures. My school leaders or school contacts listening today, we just wanted to connect that tiered fidelity inventory that you're about to complete at the end of the year. It is required for model school and recommended for all schools to get this little check-in on how are those systems features doing across tiers. That's coming up for you. And this is our measure in Florida that looks at systems at Tier 2 and Tier 3. And we once a year complete that in teams at the end of the school year and enter it in the PBS system. So just to make that connection for you. The other connection we will make with that is back to the quick systems features that I talked through with the stacked tiers. We gave you one for Tier 2 and we'll give you one that kind of adds on for Tier 3. Just reinforcing those critical foundational pieces across tiers. When we complete the measure, you have to rate your team functioning on how you're doing across teaming. How's our team functioning or operating? Are we using structured agendas? Are we making decisions based on data? Are we using a screening process with decision rules? Those of you who worked with me a lot know decision rules are my favorite because they are what makes you really efficient and quick in a school to do this well. And then we talk a lot about requests for assistance and screening, and I'll mention that in a second. And the reason we shift that language a little bit is because when we talk about referrals, it usually is that language that we're asking for help or we're referring out. And we talk about requests for assistance, we're looking at, hey, we need some more help to problem solve in on these issues that we're talking about with a group or an individual student. And we want to request more assistance to address the problem and lead to better success. So then we'll go across the others in a little more detail today and some of the case examples from districts and schools. But just my only other caveat with tier 2 is that intervention, we're at tier 2 looking for those standard protocol, what we call standard protocol, those ready to go, starting with 1 or 2, just starting to do 1 or 2 interventions well that we know are good for your age group, your students, behavioral needs, like a check-in, check-out, or a small group intervention. Before we're moving to that individualized data use, because we'll have plenty of that as we move into tier 3. So that's the quick note on tier 2. The third example we give you unpacking systems is when we do, if you have joined us, and just a quick note in the chat box, feel free to chime in. If you have heard of our tier 2 systems training, just give me a yes. Or if you've been through the school team training, you could say been through the school team training. You could just give me some quick feedback in the chat box. So if you've heard of it, or if you have been through it, because we probably have many people who have, and maybe some people who haven't, which is okay. And while you're putting that in the chat box, our tier 2 systems training focuses on the graphic you see on the screen. So when we're focusing with school teams, similar to some ones like Michelle will talk about that she works with at that systems level, we are trying to build the parts that you see in the graphic. But my district leaders listening, the other feature of this slide is there's kind of always this ongoing piece on the left of our district guidance around multi-tiered systems and our procedures and processes that's going to impact what the schools are implementing. So they're going to look for that guidance along with hopefully accessing training and support when needed, whether that's through our tier 2 systems training or experts at the local level. But they're going to use both to build the features that we're going to go through a little bit today. And then we're starting with tier 2, and then I'll give you a quick little cheat at tier 3. So we'll go through these a little bit more, but that kind of gives you the glance at the school level of what it looks like. Ooh, sorry about that. So let's see in our chat box real quick. All right, saw a lot of heard of it. Yes, great. Heard, yes, been through. We have a couple been throughs. Great. So if you have heard of it, that was a little indicator on what tier 2 systems look like. If you've been through it, some of this will sound very familiar to you. And if you haven't been through, it's a good way to think of, maybe that's something we want to go through with our team as we listen or learn today. And then the other piece of the tier fidelity is our tier 3 systems. And here what we've done is highlight the things that stand out a little bit in terms of self-reports at tier 3 systems when we're looking at those foundational pieces. So still building on a team. That team is always a requirement and a team that operates well. We're going to go through screening data today for both. But what's a little bit different across the different domains is we're starting to have that individualized focus and also a systems team that supports those individual plans and individualized focus. So we'll show you a couple examples today, and then there'll be another chat we're going to highlight later this year that will focus a little bit about what those system elements look like. But I'm going to point out one last thing here for tier 3. You can see the intensity a little bit change. For example, a couple of the items in the TFI ask you to rate on tier 3 support plans. So you're taking a look at a team of how are we implementing our tier 3 implementation of plans and what some of those indicators look like. So we really have a more intense part at self-report and where we're at, plus looking at some of the plans in our current implementation. So, and we will wrap up today with a little example of a district planning for support across those 3 levels. So again, I told you my job today is a little bit of an intro to the topic. So if I just introduce some of the systems features and I gave you a cheat sheet for tier 2, I can't leave you without a cheat for tier 3. And we have 2 beautiful ones that have come from some of our tier 3 leads in our project very recently. If you haven't seen them, that's probably why. If you have, they were put up on our website. Gosh, it seems like very recently, it was probably months ago, because that's how time is going. But at the district level, if you are a district leader, and they are embedded in the links to our live binders on our website, so you can click on those links to get them. a little bit what we mean by that district teaming and what that district supportive schools means for tier 3. And then at the school team level, what it looks like for school team membership that then the districts would be supporting. So just like we talked through that little graphic of what it looks like for tier 2, these are similar kind of summary points for the roles that you could pull for information around those system features and support. And again, they're hyperlinked there for you. So as we transition into case examples, that was big, broad overview. One thing that we get a little narrower in across when we're talking about case examples or what this looks like to implement is what is the team actually doing? So when we talk through supporting schools that are teams at the school level, we are talking about those system team features. So it's not just that person who's going to implement the check-in, check-out or going to assess with the FBA and then implementing and supporting a BIP. We're talking about those prerequisite things to have all that happen. So here you'll see if you have been through our tier 2 training in the black, those are the ones that we always talk about. The team's role is basically that screening process to identify, and we're going to give lots of examples of that today, and setting up those decision rules and how to identify them. Once we're talking about all 3 tiers being implemented, they're matching student needs, not only to interventions aligned with tier 1 at tier 2, but then for tier 3, making sure we're matching up with tier 1 and tier 2. We are planning and coordinating that person that is providing the intervention or has that expertise in FBA VIP is available and has the resources they need to do the role as a team. And then number 4, Michelle gives some great examples of this. We're going to talk through some of the district level with Marian in just a minute. But this is 4 is a planning piece. We have to have some defined decision rules of what going to put students in those tiers of support and what's going to take them out. And what's in the middle of that is what's going to decide whether they come in or out as they're in those interventions. So we'll talk a lot about that in examples, but across tiers, we're talking about those standard protocol groups like check-in, check-out, or small group instruction, plus individualized assessment or cases. And then the rest might sound pretty familiar. You just see the enhancements there that we're adding on for tier 2 and 3. We're going to go through a little more detail here. But one last point is that across all 3 tiers on your teams that you work with, really think through, do we have some knowledge or guidance around the legal ethical guidelines? Because especially when we get to our tier 3 cases, we are doing things differently than we do for all kids. So we want to be really careful with communication on those cases and also with how we implement things like consent. So with that being said, I'm going to go slightly into some case examples, starting with that first decision we have to make to go into advanced tiers. And we always start here with just general descriptions. And then I've seen teams get really good at how do we decide kids have had access to strong tier 1. So on the left here, you see some things that will look familiar to you as PBS implementers on your schools or at district. They're items that were from our highlighted in our National Center work, but also our National Center partners, but also come from the benchmarks of quality that you complete each year. So when we talk about what should kids have access to before they go to tier 2 or tier 3, we want to make sure we have a common definition of what tier 1 they should have had exposure to. So there are others like you will hear Duval does this, but they'll add in more specific examples relevant to their district or their schools. So if, for example, they're using resiliency instructional materials and that's part of tier 1, they'll add that in for what we want to see kids all having access to. Here we've given you the general practices as a PBS school that we expect to have kids access, but you could add in more specificity based on your district or school. And then the other piece of this is then we evaluate regularly. Are they receiving it with fidelity? So at the bare minimum, we talk about looking at % of fidelity for our benchmarks, our quality total score. The other one that we have a lot of schools and districts gravitate towards is our foundational classroom practices. And we did hyperlink those for you in the right. For what would that everyday work look like at the classroom and not just the school-wide level. So simply put, those are some good walkaways for tier 1 and access, but you may have more detail at your district or school level. And then I'm not going to spend a lot of times of these, but we couldn't leave you without more examples of, and again, if you've been through tier 2, you've seen some of these, but how our teams use decision rules at tier 1 for access, because that will also go into some of our case examples. And I didn't mention it, but it's a great time to mention it because it's almost walkthrough time or is walkthrough time. So a lot of our district coordinators listening are coming through and supporting schools with our walkthrough. So it's another way to support team self-report with what's going on the campus. What is tier 1 looking like? Where are our strengths? what do we want to celebrate versus things that we really want to improve at tier 1 for our school campus. So that's another measure that's wasn't in the last slide that's coming up. It's a great one for tier 1. Okay, so case examples, we're going to start here with screening and decision making. So when we talk about screening, and that's coming back to the graphic that was at tier 2, we're using multiple sources of data to triage, to decide what we want kids to be receiving or meet expectation for tier 1 versus they are starting to show us they're at risk and we need to provide some supplemental supports. So if we're doing this well, we're going to use data that we can use for both purposes. Are they showing us tier 1 expectations? And are they showing us a level of risk? And we're going to try to apply those consistently across the campus. So that's where the planning comes in. So quick walk away for you is, why do we want multiple data sources? It's going to, and I'm gonna let you cheat real quick in the chat box. Why do you think we want multiple sources in screening, guys? Just in the chat box, what are some thoughts? Why do you want to use more than one data source when we screen for students who might be at risk? What thoughts do you have?
I'm keeping an eye on the chat.
Thanks. And I asked that's a brave one to put out there. So I'll throw some up there. But if we're thinking of, oh, thank you, my brave people who came out there, demonstrate consistency, triangulation, Larry Porter, I should have known that's Larry Porter, triangulation of ensure we cut all students, right? Full picture of student. Oh, thank you, Rebecca. Love it. Internalizing, externalizing. So my brave folks that just jumped in there, you are spot on. We are looking for varying viewpoints or perspectives. We're looking for limits, not just having the limits of one source, but multiple. We're looking for things we can use easily to define function or motivation, so we can pair it with an intervention. And to Rebecca's point, we want those internalizing and externalizing concerns. And last but not least, especially at tier 2, we're trying to make this integrate as quickly as possible as we can with our academic supports on campus. So generally, to all the points in the chat box, to my friends who jumped out there with them, this is what makes it effective. That's an effective screening process to have multiple. So before I introduce Marianne's examples and some from Duval, we pulled a couple from one from a model school that submitted with us last year, and we pulled them intentionally because it was an elementary school campus where the district guidance was pretty broad. So the district had given things like look for a certain number, literally like a blank, certain number of discipline referrals or a certain number of attendance. And this school did a good job going through and saying, what do we mean by a certain number of something to put us at the expectation? So no or low risk here. What's the expectation for being where we want you to be versus at risk or high risk? And they use lots of criteria there. So my elementaries are not usually ones to just rely on suspensions. They're wanting to go more proactive and preventive with things like you see in their table, where we're looking at things that might catch kids more quicker. There we go. It's better. Quicker than something like a discipline referral or suspension. So that's why we pulled that particular example. And those of you who've been through tier 2 training, we talk a lot about this and setting up those decision rules. On the right, just to give you more of a basic, not as pretty example, is just to keep in mind here your school improvement plans, especially my secondary friends. So if we are, and I know not all schools complete school improvement plans, but if they're in a certain level of performance, they are, where they operationalize already and a school's already pulled their early warning indicators, as you see on the right, to start that idea of how many kids do we have at a certain level where we'd expect them to, or sorry, the inverse of that, where we don't want them to be. So absence 10% or more days, for example. So keeping that in mind that's something that's already in existence where schools are looking at that data and might have some data they can use for that first round of screening if they complete at the end of the year, or if it's at the beginning of the year towards the beginning of the year. So we have to go a little bit further, and I'm going to let Michelle steal that show in a second, but I'm going to leave you with a chat box question. So that was a lot of talking at you. When you think of your data sources and the multiple data sources you could be pulled from at the top, what are some examples of data, and not just data, but the criteria you use to identify students for tier 2 interventions? Start with that one. Maybe it's a percentage of absences, or it's a number of referrals. Just any indicators that you use at the school level, or maybe it's teacher requests, nominations. And then the other question for you is, what might guide a rare use of tier 3 supports before providing tier 2? We might provide them at the same time in that case. So just to leave you with that, as far as different data sources we might use to screen and putting some criteria to them. Did we have any thoughts on that? Oh, Marianne Nickel, I just saw your last one. Excellent as usual, Marianne, down there in the Keys. Okay, so this one seems like it upped the ante a little bit. I encourage you to think about it as we go through some of the examples because we'll have lots of them today. But the key here is screening and triaging. We always call it triaging. Is not just using the multiple sources, but establishing some guidance on that criteria, very similar to these examples,
And
like the
Kat,
elementaries on the left and on the right. Yes,
we're
ma'am.
getting some chat box answers. Folks were thinking and typing. Did you see that?
Thanks, Rebecca, jumping out there again. Excellent job. The nurse visits. Oh, you're welcome,
Mhm.
Marianne. And Marianne Masters, yes. So we're majority of students responding, Mason, I like that one. And then Rebecca, I like your point of the nurse visits. Nurse visits is a common one or time out of class that we might look at, especially at elementary level, to start signifying maybe that internalizing concern. And then to Masons, looking at number of ODRs or number of classroom issues might help us with screening, but also with kids responding to classroom supports. Okay, so I'm going to hand it over to, to Ms. Dama to go through some mirroring examples before I introduce before I introduce Michelle to talk through some case examples at Duval.
All right. Thanks, Kat.
Sure.
So this slide is just kind of some reminders for us to think about when you're thinking through the lens of district guidance and district supports. I know many of you serve in a role where you're supporting maybe multiple schools or all of the schools in your district. So thinking about what are some things that are helpful in terms of district guidance and then what's not so helpful. And some of those helpful things that districts can do is really help to identify evidence-based interventions across a variety of skills and functions. So you can, meet a variety of needs that students might have, but also across all the different age levels, school levels. So thinking, from that pre-K through 12th grade, what are the potential things that we're going to need to, support students with in terms of those evidence-based interventions, and then narrowing that down. What are we willing to maybe either fund or we're allowing students to buy if we're not funding them at the district level? Are they available? Do schools have access to these? And are we going to provide that ongoing training and support and coaching for schools? So it's important at the district level, to identify what will we support, what do we have the ability to support in terms of training and coaching and providing, technical assistance with implementation of those interventions at the school level. And then also identifying who is available to support those interventions. So if that's, maybe by a particular role, so it could be within your district, school counselors are maybe trained and provided all of the professional development to be able to implement and or provide support with implementation of particular interventions at the school level. Maybe it's, school psychologists or social workers, behavior specialists, really kind of determining at the district and school level, who are those folks that can support the different interventions that are available within the district. And then also engaging in resource mapping across those tier 2 and tier 3 supports. So thinking from a district lens, sort of like Kat's example, starting vague, not vague, but like broad, where, here are all of the interventions that are available. Here's, what the school level or the grade level that they're appropriate for. Here are the types of skills or behaviors that they're going to help instruct or teach and support. And here are the types of, we'll get into function in a moment, the types of functions of behaviors that these interventions might support, and mapping that out at the district level, but then also kind of like that fill in the blank example. What can schools now do in terms of resource mapping within the school, determining which of those interventions are appropriate for the students that are served at the school level? What's not helpful is letting schools sort of adopt their own interventions and procedures. Sometimes we think, we're being helpful by letting schools figure that out or do what they want, but they really need support and guidance. So it's not helpful to kind of let them make their own decisions. It's most helpful when we can consistently provide that guidance at the district level. And then also, if your district is like the ones that I've worked in and supported, with a lot of mobility, so students that are moving from one school to the next, the zip code should not determine the types of supports they're going to get within a district. So really trying to provide that guidance helps. Not so helpful to let schools figure that out on their own. Also not helpful would be to not have the resources to provide training and coaching. So if we're going to, support some evidence-based interventions and we're going to allow schools and encourage them to use those interventions, we also need to make sure that we've got some identified training opportunities and coaching resources for schools who are implementing those interventions. Also, it's not helpful when we haven't thought through the roles of staff members that are going to assist and implement the interventions, or if we're only kind of leaving that up to things that classroom teachers can do and adding to their plates. And then also, if we are individualizing function-based assessments and behavior plans only, so we have to kind of think more broadly about how we are encouraging and supporting schools at that systems level to really use function-based assessments to determine how we're going to identify and group students. And also, it's not helpful when we only have that guidance at the academic level. So we often think through and have a well thought out plan for the academic interventions and intervention time for academics, but providing just that side of the house is not helpful when we're looking at how to support all of our students. And I think we're going to move into an example. Oh, sorry, I'm going to talk a little bit about function. I got ahead of myself. So thinking about the function of behavior, this can be tricky. And if you have questions, I know sometimes we ask for your examples and input in the chat box, but feel free to drop questions in the chat box as well, because it's a little challenging to think about group function of behavior. So hopefully this visual will help kind of simplify that, thinking about the interventions you have available, and then what are the interventions most appropriate for, and then grouping students by what they're trying to get out of that inappropriate behavior or situationally inappropriate. So students that like adult attention and respond well to that, they want adult attention, that would be appropriate for groups of students to be placed in check-in, check-out. Hopefully you can see the small font of our slide there. This is just an example, thinking about students, who maybe want peer attention, they want to avoid adult attention. Maybe they need a social skills group. So they're not looking for just the adult attention, but they're really looking for peer attention. Maybe they don't want attention from adults, and so they need those skills. So they're looking for skill building. And so thinking through from a systems level, we're not going to have every individual student figured out. This isn't the time to do, an intensive functional behavior assessment, but really thinking broadly about grouping our students into these categories. These kiddos want attention from adults. These want, some social interaction with their peers. These students are trying to get out of something, whether that's attention or, time with adults, maybe getting out of tasks and trying to avoid tasks. So knowing some of that information can help us to group students and teach them the, more appropriate, school appropriate types of skills to get what it is they're, trying to get out of their, situationally inappropriate behavior, but do it in a more appropriate way and give them some skills in the process. As we move into some examples, thinking about, how do we know that right away? Some schools that I've worked with and districts that I've worked with have started the process. Students that they already know the function of the behavior, can go ahead and be matched to the interventions that are most appropriate. For those students that maybe we don't really know, starting with something like getting them into check-in, check-out, so we can start to see them, keep an eye on them, get to know the students. You'll know pretty soon if they don't like adult attention, if they're not checking in and checking out, that is usually an indicator that's not very reinforcing for them. So that's good data to say, okay, maybe they would be more appropriate for one of these social skills groups that we've got available. So sometimes it's just a matter of getting them plugged into check in, check out initially as that first layer of tier 2 support, so that we can get to know a little bit more about what it is that they are getting out of their behaviors. If we need to get to know them a little bit more, maybe they're presenting more internalizing and we're not quite sure how we can support them. So when in doubt, spend some time with those kiddos, put them in that type of group intervention, so you can collect a little bit more information and get to know what the function of their behavior might be. In Marion, they've done a really nice job of putting together some district support.
Sorry, Dama, I was going to move you on there. I'm so sorry. And I was just going to note, we always let you know this is, she said quick cheat sheet, but some of them can be adjusted by function. For example, check in, check out can be adjusted for function, but it's initially intended for adult attention. And then another note, because I see the skills groups, a lot of my districts right now are, of course, merging that language with resiliency instruction and the resiliency skill or life skill groups. So make sure, I know it's relevant to you guys right now, anything you're working on with tier 1 instruction would apply, because you're doing more instruction in those skill groups with approved programs and curricula. And then Dama, sorry, I'll move you on to Marion's examples.
All good. Jump in anytime. In Marion, this has really been a work in progress and has evolved over time into, really supported, well thought out guidance documents that they update annually. Thinking back to many years ago when this first was developed and this guidance was provided, they did a great job of pulling in different stakeholders that would be involved in, providing support or implementing interventions, utilizing some of the, resiliency lessons. And as an example, pulling in some teachers, some district level support staff, principals, assistant principals, folks that really help with discipline at the school level. So this was not just put together by folks that maybe have expertise around intervention planning, but really was put together by bringing in lots of, state representative people from different stakeholder groups to weigh in and give input on what is it that we're using, what data do we have to support that these interventions are working for our students, and then begin to kind of build on that and like I said, update it and make it even more user friendly. And so what you'll see here is really just well thought out tiered interventions for resiliency and behavior. And across the top are the different personnel that might be involved across the different interventions or across the different tiers and what that might look like. So all students, are having access to and receiving good tier 1 instruction around resiliency, around those, tier 1 school-wide expectations. And so how the different roles can support students at tier 1. And then at tier 2, interventions grouped by like need. So thinking about the needs of the students and the functions of those behaviors, grouping students, and then the team that might provide some problem solving and some guidance and support around, identifying and monitoring those students and talking about, how they're doing and making those determinations about when students are ready to exit an intervention and kind of thinking about that from a big picture standpoint. And then tier 3, thinking about, that tier 3 team and what the function of that team is and how they support students. And then as you get into the next couple of boxes, resiliency support pathway identifies resiliency, across the school-wide, lessons that are being taught and ways that students are being supported across the district and all of the schools. And then at tier 2, a little intervention guidance for the evidence-based interventions that are available and supported in the district. The multidisciplinary team is who meets, twice monthly, at least once monthly, but most schools in Marion meet twice monthly to look at that data, to talk about students that are needing that tier 2 intervention, talking about, different rules around parent notification and parent permission for access to those interventions and supports. And then at tier 3, mental health counseling and some of the supports that are available for students that need that tier 3 support when we're thinking about resiliency, and then thinking more specific about behavior support. Similar, there's some tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 guidance that the district provides around what those processes are, the evidence-based interventions that are supported, and who has been trained to support, coach, train school personnel in the implementation of those interventions. So this is just something, like I said, that's updated. There's hyperlinks to internal documents and forms and resources that are required within the district that the team can easily access when looking at resiliency and behavior from a big picture standpoint.
Great example. And I love the specificity or connection to the resiliency language across tiers. And I also love that tier 3 emphasizes all kids, not just for students with disabilities. So to Marianne's kudos. And the role specificity with the interventions, I think is great.
Absolutely. They've done a really nice job of making sure the language is consistent for all students with or without a 504 plan, with or without an individual education plan, thinking about all students and what they can receive at tier 1 and those tier 2 and tier 3 supports. This one, I believe, is kind of a 2-pager or maybe a front and back where it's broken down a little bit more, thinking about some of the language that you all are accustomed to us talking about. When we think of tier 1, we expect or anticipate that about 80% of students are going to respond favorably to the tier 1 instruction. And they've done a nice job of thinking about what that might look like or given examples when you think about academics, behavior, attendance, resiliency, and again, some hyperlinks so that folks can, access any sort of documentation or resources around those interventions and supports, but thinking about, tier 1 instruction. And so, Kat, to your point, they've really done a nice job of incorporating the resiliency language. They use Caring School Community at the elementary level and Habitudes at the middle and high school level. And so there are links there to help schools easily click on that and check out lessons that are related to the different skills that are being supported and kind of pushed out and encouraged from month to month. And then you'll also, those of you thinking, okay, this is PBIS Technical Assistance Chat. If you look over to the behavior box, you'll see the 10 critical elements of PBIS there. And again, like some hyperlinks for schools to check out how do we measure that, a hyperlink to the walkthrough and the benchmarks of quality. And so that's, their guidance around this is how we determine, fidelity of implementation of tier 1 and checking our outcomes, looking at discipline data and climate surveys as examples. And then encouraging schools to use, planning teams, positive behavior support teams at tier 1 to meet and collaborate and plan and problem solve that data. Then at the next level, some examples across academic behavior, attendance, and resiliency at tier 2. And then again, hyperlinked the district supported evidence-based interventions that are available. And along with, those hyperlinks, that leads to some really nice summary sheets. I think they're still being worked on and developed. So I don't want to tease you too much with some examples there, but stay tuned. We'll continue to share what they're putting together. But they have summary sheets that kind of explain this is the intervention, here's who it's appropriate for, this is, the function of behavior that it meets the need of, and resources around how to progress monitor, and some with fidelity, monitoring fidelity of implementation, which is great. And they're also working really hard on making that uniform. And then at tier 3, knowing that students, a small percentage of our students are going to need some support, but they also encourage, through the use of this visual, that layering. I think Kat mentioned earlier, tier 2 interventions are layered with tier 1 to support tier 1, and tier 3, also should be supporting and just intensifying to meet the needs of students. And so again, just kind of layering that on the big picture tier 1 that all students are receiving. And then the next document is another one of their, documents that's updated, as they collect data and determine interventions maybe are not working as well for groups of students, or maybe, they're not going to be able to support through, funding or training and that sort of thing. But they often refer to it as the stair step. Kind of looks like a stair step, but it goes through the interventions that the district supports for, in the first column, students that may experience anxiety, depression, trauma, and self-esteem issues. Criteria to determine that. So how they encourage schools to identify students that might need that help, and then district supported interventions available, progress monitoring recommendations, and then exit criteria, kind of broad for schools to then make those decision rules around, students that are going to need that intervention, how we're going to monitor progress of the intervention and determine that they've met their goals and that they're ready to exit or may need more intensified support. And then kind of goes across. So there's self-regulation and impulse control, aggression and anger management, skill building, social skills, sort of the skill instruction, and then those that might struggle with performance and motivation. And then lastly, how do we determine that they're on level or that they're, meeting that success criteria? And so this is, again, just some nice district guidance that they work on to push out for schools to know when they're trying to make these decisions, what the district supports and has available, and can work with, schools on that implementation.
So Mary, I was just going to jump in real quick because when we shift to Michelle in just a second, she'll kind of walk through a nice example of in, out, and she'll walk through a couple of those at a school level too. But really nice district guidance support, and just that the BEST, in case you're not familiar with it, is a standardized screening measure. So for behavior. So when we talk about internalizing risk, they are a district that can use that as a decision rule for internalizing risk. If you don't, you may have to go over something like the internalizing ones that were mentioned earlier. So attendance or nurse visits, but great examples, Dama. Thank you for that.
Yes.
Awesome.
And I'm glad you mentioned that. So think, from district lens, if you're thinking we need to create some of these, use the idea, but plug in the content that makes sense. So if you're not using a universal screening, what would you encourage, your schools to use to identify students, thinking of, the information Kat's shared around using multiple sources to identify students, and how are you going to capture those kiddos with internalizing concerns. And then thinking through, again, from that district level of support, you want to make sure you're helping, encouraging, schools to identify how are they going to monitor progress of individual students, like students that are meeting their goals and maybe ready to exit out of that intervention group. But then also wanting to think about that from a systems perspective to ensure, you're getting the biggest bang for your buck. So are the interventions that we're supporting, are they meeting the needs of our students? So we want to have a way of thinking about how do we evaluate our system? Are we capturing the kiddos that need intervention? Are the interventions that we're providing meeting their needs? And sort of thinking through both the system evaluation and individual evaluation, and that fidelity piece. And that can be a struggle. Sometimes interventions, academic and behavioral, will come with some recommended fidelity tools, but it's important, from a district perspective, to think about what is it that schools can use for the different interventions that we support for both progress monitoring and to determine that the interventions are being implemented with fidelity. Because we can't really make good decisions about whether or not a student is ready to exit, if they're, successful or they need more intensive support, if we're unsure if those interventions are being implemented with fidelity, and that might, be impacting student progress.
So we have given you in this one a progress report template, like Dana was saying, and fidelity tool. I'm going to skip us forward a little bit so we make sure to give Michelle some time, because what Dana just nicely summarizing from the district level, we'll give a couple more examples from the different coaching examples she's had. But the walkaway point, as Dana just said nicely, was that you have to identify, that's the planning part, progress monitoring, fidelity tools, and then how we're going to use it. The other slides that we gave you were some examples of that. So we gave you an example of our model school that had one for social skills for a progress report and a fidelity checklist. We see lots of schools who are doing progress monitoring, but not check-in fidelity. So lots of them. So we want to make sure we're doing both, as Dama said nicely. And it helps, as she just said, well, to establish that ahead of time. I'm going to skip ahead of some of this because I want to make sure I honor time for Michelle. But to Dama's point last, we gave you an example of individualized decision-making with a decision rule for exit versus group. Because again, the group we can't emphasize enough. That's often missing of the evaluation of systems. So at the beginning, I did forget to let you know, we hyperlinked a sample systems agenda for you in the team roles. but we also hyperlinked if you are still old school. Like I used to be in the schools, we were literally using Excel tools. There's an old school Excel tool for you to use when we want to look at group response. You may have a better data system for doing that, and we're hoping in the future to be able to offer one soon for you to do that. So I'm going to introduce Michelle Johnson, and I have the pleasure of working with Michelle. Michelle, it's been almost 8 years. That's insane to me, but it's been 8 years of knowing and admiring the great Michelle. Michelle has extensive experience as a district coach and working with school teams to build their capacity to do this stuff. And I did that for many years in the beginning of my career, and it's great experience. You learn a lot. You help your teams. You learn what they need. So I can't say that enough. She has across secondary and elementary some good experience at that coaching level. So I'm going to let her talk as we wrap up today about Duval and some school-based coaching examples and tools that she's used in supporting teams. So Michelle, I'm going to let you take it away.
All right, thanks, Kat.
Sure.
I do want
forgot her
to.
quote real quick. Her quote
Oh.
is, "We don't have time for interventions that don't work." That is Michelle's quote that she says in presentations all the time, and I love it. So we do not have time to do interventions that don't work. Great one. Go for it, Michelle.
All right, and I want to be sensitive to your time. I do want to say first off that this is work that's been culminated over a long period of time. As Kat said, I've been working with her for like 8+ years and 3 different grants. So if you're a district personnel or you're school-based and you're like, whoa, we have worked together, and Kat has been with us since the initial work, and it has been targeted, selected, smaller segments. We have 191 schools. So some of this has been implemented in smaller schools or smaller number of schools because it's a grant. So my video is going unbelievably crazy today.
She's got
So
like a party with her video. I love it.
I'm not gonna have that going on for y'all. So we started with our work looking at what teams are actually in the building. We wanted to not add to people's plates, but look what we have functioning already and existing and build from there. And so you see this, the MLT team, which really addresses a lot of the tier 1, but we formulated what we called the collaborative problem solving team to really help to enhance the tier 2 and tier 3 support. And we looked at, again, what team members are on existing teams, what team members could come together to reflect a broad base segment of our school in terms of leadership. So having mental health at the table, have district social work at the table, have instructional coaches at the table, deans, always an administrator who can have decision-making capacity. So bringing all these ESE represented to the table to develop that collaborative problem solving team. So that was like our teaming initially to begin to look at the interventions that we needed in our school. One of the things that I have been working strongly with, my current grant is with 9 elementary schools. Prior to that, it was 8 targeted middle schools, is really getting that dedicated meeting time. What you're seeing on the screen is my calendar. Colors indicate different schools that I meet with. So initially, when we started the work in the summer, when we had some training with the school teams, I said, we need to set our meetings up. The elementary grant, I'm meeting with them twice a month. And very important to establish this early on. So I put all of this on an Outlook invite on a calendar so that our team members know when we're going to meet. It's never a second thought. I send reminders that we're going to be meeting tomorrow, friendly reminder, make sure and have all your data and any information ready. Just having that confidential space. And also on the calendar, we have training, screening windows, lots of friendly reminders. And I am the second year of cohort 1 on the 9 elementary schools. And I can say with full confidence, these people are used to meeting twice a month with me. It goes really, really smoothly. The first year I was shocked because I had previously just worked with middle school. These people are very, very committed to the work, and it's exciting to see that. So dedicated meeting time sets the foundation. It's going to happen. In the beginning, we had to look at what we have. I know Damon was talking about district resources, and we have a district resource map, but we needed to know what was in the schools. So this was an activity that I did with them. And again, I'm focusing on behavioral support. What is in the building? What I found out was school teams often didn't know everything that was available. So this was a learning exercise, but we identified what our resources are to help with tier 1, 2, and 3. And we review this regularly because sometimes some mentoring groups will start to work with the schools, or a new source of an intervention will be provided to the school. And so we want to make sure and be flexible. But it helped teams to understand what we have so that we could begin to place students and pair them in interventions based on the data that we were reviewing. So this grant that I'm working on is enhanced universal screening. So we have first time ever in our district, we have internalizing data on elementary schools with a self-report. And then we had previously externalizing a very comprehensive screener that we've been using. So this is the first time that we've done both internalizing and externalizing, first time student self-report, and we are screening twice a year. So it's very exciting to get this data and work with teams to determine appropriate interventions. So to refine our practice, and we've talked about this, using data to make decisions about students, understanding what interventions we need, but how do we get students? It's okay, Kat, go to that next slide. It's how
Yeah,
do,
sorry.
what's the need that we have based on our data and multiple sources of data? And then, how are we going to implement that intervention? Who's going to be responsible? How do you get into that intervention? What's that entrance criteria? We had to look at globally all of the data and make some determinations. And you can see that outcome measures. We look at how many students are responding. We actually review that frequently because we want to make sure the interventions we're doing are effective. This is a great example, check in and check out, because we have a lot of data and we tend to want to start students at the lowest tier 2 intervention possible, which for us is check in and check out. You can go to the next slide. So we developed with the team's decision rules. It aligns with the resource map. So what's our intervention? We did, again, that inventory, what was in our school. How do you get in? And this was determined through data and through team processing. And how are we going to measure fidelity? This is a growth area and new for our schools, and progress monitoring and teaching students, teaching the team members. It's not about a feeling. It's actually about data, data. Let's talk about data. Let's move away from our feelings about how students are making progress, which is really exciting to watch teams become more precise in their work. And then how do you get out? We're not leaving anybody in an intervention for 40 forevers. We don't have time for that, right? So how do you get out of the intervention, or how do you fade out? So this defines it very clear. The other thing, it helps the team understand that a lot of things can go on outside of the team meeting because we have lots and lots of students that need help, but we have precision information and a precise problem solving process and determinate factors to place students responsibly in intervention. All of my work has been to reduce disparity, students working and being placed in intervention. So this gives us a strong guidelines, which is very objective.
And I'm just highlighting the planning aspect because she is across several different levels of schools and different types of grants. This resource mapping with the decision rule, the planning piece with teams is something Michelle does wonderfully with her teams, but also just to illustrate that planning aspect I was talking about at the beginning that it takes to then make this go well in everyday work.
And I would say too, if you haven't been doing that previously, teams really respond well to that, because who doesn't want concrete information, right? We all like to know what's first, what's second, what's next. And so it really helps to streamline our best practices. So we use the tips, the team initiated problem solving. Part of this grant that I'm currently working on utilizes tips. We have made some modifications to the tips form, but we have a meeting format. We have a facilitator, we have a minute taker, we have different roles, and you can see those across the top. We always have an agenda. So this is really, again, streamlined. We use time wisely. My teams meet at 8:50 until 8:20 or 25, again, twice a month. So we get in, we start to work right away, but we know what's on the agenda because you can see agenda items for next meeting. That always becomes our agenda for the following meeting. So this is placed in a confidential team setting for our Thrive team. And we have all of these minutes, we have the agenda, we have our data stored there. So we start off our meetings with how many requests for assistance. So we do use that as opposed to referral. So we can get requests for assistance from our teachers, our parents, wide variety of sources. and we want to respond to those. And we also want to look at, are we being timely and effective? So how much time between the request for assistance and placing an intervention are we going? And then we go and summarize, okay, how many students are actually in check-in and check-out? How many are supported by the intervention? How many are making progress? Do we need to do action planning for students, or what we call specific problem solving? How many students are continuing? How many students are fading? So part of this that you're not seeing is the precision problem solving process, which once we cover the total number of students in tier 2 and tier 3 interventions, students that need further action, we do an in-depth problem solving process: who, what, where, when, how, and why, to really dig into, as we were talking before, about function of behavior and understanding more about what the child needs. And if they are not responding to the lowest level of intervention, we want to do this problem solving process to be more accurate in our support for the student.
So a couple things, Michelle, that she just said, that a great example at the wrap up there of how you intensify problem solving for kids who may not respond to those standard protocol or go to like check in, check out. Two is she's showing tips. That's their operating procedures in the TFI for their agenda. We also put a sample hyperlink for you in the team. That's a similar template of how you might run your system's agenda. So if you want more information, we can put more on tips. Her particular grant has this as the agenda and structure. But the one you'll see in the generic in the front is a similar type of functioning for a systems team, but great example of structure that they use every time in this team meeting to help them make the decisions and address the things they need to for the systems. And then last thing before I move you on was the Marianne, the BIMUS, gosh, I should be able to say that by
BIMUS,
now.
yeah.
Michelle, I should be able to say that. Their screener, that's their universal screener they use at, ooh, Michelle, 6th, 9th, and 4th still?
Well, we've had it 4th, 6th, and 9 this past year. I am working in the elementary school, so all 4th and 5th graders are screened with the BIMUS, which is the teacher report. And then all 4th and 5th graders do the self-report, which we use the EIS, which is the educational instructional system, which is the student self-report, which is brand new, and it's internalizing data, which we've never had before. And that in itself has been a journey, really breaking that down with teams, because it is brand new and the students are telling us a lot of information that we don't see from the acting out. And it's really powerful to hear their, have them have a voice finally and tell us what they need.
So thank you for the question, Marianne. I want to make sure we addressed it. That's their measure that looks at internalizing as a screener. And then she was mentioning the adaptations they're doing in secondary for self-report. And then Michelle, we had a great example of how you've evaluated and this was a middle school group from one of your past work, but just because it was used in one of our national documents, by the way, but how she looked at response was pretty exciting. And when they were putting the things that she's been going over with you in place, you want to talk through the celebrations you had as far as one middle school's
Right.
grades?
Yes. So we use the Match ADTC, which is a very standardized small group format, which has all the lessons, lesson 1, 2, 3, but it addresses anxiety, depression, trauma, and conduct. And the success was, this was used in middle school. We had 2 therapists that were on the grant providing small groups exclusively for their targeted schools. We had 2 students that had a history of Baker Act or involuntary hospitalization, and working with the therapist on a weekly basis, we're able to actually, from the time that we began implementing small group, did not have any more involuntary hospitalizations through the rest of the school year, which was almost a semester. We use the feelings thermometer in the group so students learn to understand what's going on with themselves, and they also learn how to implement coping skills to help regulate that thermometer or change or make changes. So the therapist would use this in the beginning of the group and at the end of the group, so we could see how the intervention was really impacting the students. We had great success with this. I highly recommend it. It's super easy to do, and it's highly scripted, but absolutely fabulous cognitive behavioral therapy coping skills, lots of tools that kids can take away just from one lesson.
Awesome. And just a nice snapshot of at a school level, looking at across a continuum of intervention. So they were looking at basics, she said, with check and check out, plus more intense options at tier 2, and then also students within those tier 2 supports that were getting tier 3. And we did hyperlink our sample intervention summary. It's just it's nothing fancy. It's a table that does some of the evaluation of Michelle, what she talked through, or if you're using an agenda like the sample we provided at the beginning or tips, you're doing some of that evaluation in your meetings. Oh, Michelle. So thank you to Michelle. She is a wealth. I really wish we had more time with her today. You are welcome to chat questions for her in the chat box as we wrap up, because we want to be respectful of everyone's time because we are at 11. So the last things I had for you was just that we do have a chat coming up more specifically to that continuum of supports for tier 3. We have pulled a poll up for you to do, but I did want to leave just on the screen a little example for Dama, if you can stick with us, to talk through for district planning from Volusia County of how they're starting to support at the district level, that we provide that tier 2 support and tier 3. Those of you who do have to leave, please do the chat poll for us, but I'll also let Dama wrap us up with a district planning example, and then join us for that chat on the continuum if you can.
Absolutely. As you're doing that poll, just a couple of things that I wanted to highlight that Volusia is working on. If you're thinking, okay, we are maybe a little farther ahead and we want to pull all of this together, they've done a nice job of providing support at the district level to ensure all school teams have been through the 3-day tier 1 team training, and then continuing to provide tier 2 training for teams as their tier 1, as showing evidence that they've got a good tier 1 in place and they're ready for that more systematic approach to tier 2. And then now we're in the works. Tomorrow, actually, Brooke Curtis and I will be joining them to talk to principals about some training opportunities with Prevent, Teach, Reinforce that will be engaged in Volusia to better support what they're doing, kind of more consistent support at tier 3. And so just a nice example of how they've gone across the tiers from the district level to try to make those connections for schools and make it easier for schools to consistently implement across all 3 tiers to better improve our outcomes for individual students and the system.
Oh, thanks, Dama. Way to go under pressure with our last couple of minutes here. But we did want to leave you that a tidbit on planning for those continuum, plus join us for the chat that Jason and Brooke will be doing on that continuum tier 3 supports if you want to dive in more there. Please complete the chat. And then last, thank you to my co-presenters, especially Michelle Johnson, for joining us. And she put her email in the chat because she's that amazing of a person. So if you do have additional questions, please reach out. Like I said, her experience is so valuable and expertise. If you're wanting more questions across different types of schools and what she's seen, she from that team capacity building level is just a jewel, and she's plus an amazing person. So we thank you for the time, guys. I know we're over. We'll hang out for a couple more minutes in case there are questions we can answer, and then please complete the poll for us because we do use that data. Otherwise, thank you.